Society is right on track for a global collapse, new study of infamous 1970s report finds. Human society is on track for a collapse in the next 2 decades if there isn't a serious shift in global priorities, according to a new reassessment of a 1970s report, Vice reported. In that report, published in the best-selling book The Limits to Growth, 1972, a team of MIT scientists argued that industrial civilization was bound to collapse if corporations and governments continued to pursue continuous economic growth, no matter the costs. The researchers forecasted 12 possible scenarios for the future, most of which predicted a point where natural resources would become so scarce that further economic growth would become impossible, and personal welfare would plummet. The report's most infamous scenario, the business as usual, BAU, scenario, predicted that the world's economic growth would peak around the 2040s, then take a sharp downturn, along with the global population, food availability and natural resources. This imminent collapse wouldn't be the end of the human race, but rather a societal turning point that would see standards of living drop around the world for decades, the team wrote. Harrington found that the current state of the world, measured through 10 different variables, including population, fertility rates, pollution levels, food production and industrial output, aligned extremely closely with 2 of the scenarios proposed in 1972, namely the BAU scenario and one called Comprehensive Technology, CT, in which technological advancements help reduce pollution and increase food supplies, even as natural resources run out. While the CT scenario results in less of a shock to the global population and personal welfare, the lack of natural resources still leads to a point where economic growth sharply declines, in other words, a sudden collapse of industrial society. The BAU and CT scenarios show a halt in growth within a decade or so from now, Harrington wrote in her study. This path begins as the BAU and CT routes do, with population, pollution and economic growth rising in tandem while natural resources decline. The difference comes when humans decide to deliberately limit economic growth on their own, before a lack of resources forces them to. The SW scenario assumes that in addition to the technological solutions, global societal priorities change, Harrington wrote. On a graph of the SW scenario, industrial growth and global population begin to level out shortly after this shift in values occurs. Food availability continues to rise to meet the needs of the global population, pollution declines and all but disappears, and the depletion of natural resources begins to level out, too. It's entirely possible, Harrington said, for humans to respond similarly to the ongoing climate crisis, if we make a deliberate, society-wide choice to do so.